On November 27, 2024, a ceasefire agreement brokered by the United States and France officially halted 60 days of escalating conflict between Israel and Hezbollah along the Lebanese border. Within 72 hours of that agreement taking effect, Israeli ground forces had not withdrawn. They had advanced. Not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing thrust, but in the quiet, methodical way that military planners prefer. Incremental, deniable, and almost entirely unreported by the outlets that had spent 2 months covering every rocket trajectory in both directions. The ceasefire, it turns out, did not end the expansion of Israeli military positioning in southern Lebanon. It accelerated it. That is not an opinion. That is a sequence of documented events that almost nobody in the Western press is willing to describe plainly, and the silence around it tells you something far more important than the events themselves. Let's be precise about what the public was told. American and French officials announced the ceasefire framework on November 26th, with coordinated messaging that emphasized mutual de-escalation, a 60-day implementation window for the Lebanese armed forces to deploy south of the Litani River, and Israeli withdrawal from Lebanese territory as the reciprocal condition. Secretary of State Antony Blinken described it as a durable end to hostilities. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot called it a foundation for Lebanese sovereignty. The mainstream framing was consistent and reassuring. Two exhausted parties stepping back from the brink, supervised by credible Western guarantors, with a clear timeline and mutual obligations. CNN, the BBC, Reuters, the institutional infrastructure of Western news, reported the announcement with the language of resolution. The word ceasefire carries enormous cognitive weight. It signals stopping. It signals reversal. It signals that what was happening is no longer happening.
What was actually happening is different in ways that matter. Israeli forces maintained positions inside Lebanese territory, specifically in areas around the town of Qiyam in the eastern sector and in the hills overlooking Akura on the coast. These were not temporary footholds pending orderly withdrawal. In the weeks following the ceasefire announcement, satellite imagery analyzed by independent researchers and Lebanese civil society groups documented Israeli bulldozers constructing what appeared to be access roads and earthworks in at least 3 locations inside the designated buffer zone. By mid-December 2024, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, had recorded more than 200 violations of the ceasefire terms, the overwhelming majority attributed to Israeli military activity. 200 violations in approximately 3 weeks. That is not the behavior of a party honoring the agreement it signed. It is the behavior of a party that signed the agreement as a tactical instrument rather than a strategic commitment. The question that Western commentary has conspicuously avoided is, why? Not why Israel would want strategic depth in southern Lebanon. That motivation is well documented and predates this conflict by decades. The real question is why the United States and France, as co-guarantors, have not publicly acknowledged the violation pattern, and what that silence tells us about the actual architecture of the deal that was struck behind the language of diplomacy. To understand the military logic at work here, you have to abandon the ceasefire framework entirely and think in terms of what the Israeli Defense Forces actually accomplished during 60 days of ground and air operations in southern Lebanon, and what they could not complete before the diplomatic clock ran out. The IDF's primary operational objectives in Lebanon were not simply to degrade Hezbollah's rocket inventory, though that was the stated justification. The deeper objective was infrastructural. The systematic destruction of Hezbollah's command and control architecture, its tunnel network, and its pre-positioned weapons caches in the terrain between the Israeli border and the Litani River. That objective was not finished when the ceasefire was announced. It was interrupted, and the construction activity observed in the weeks after the ceasefire suggests that Israeli forces are using the pause not to withdraw but to consolidate positions that give them persistent access to the operational zone once the 60-day window closes or collapses. The specific weapon systems that shape this calculus are worth naming. Israel's use of GBU-28 bunker-busting munitions, supplied by the United States, was extensively documented during the campaign. These are deep penetration bombs designed specifically to destroy hardened underground infrastructure. The Hezbollah tunnel network in southern Lebanon, constructed over 2 decades with Iranian engineering support and an estimated investment of over $1 billion, was the primary target. But tunnel networks of that complexity are not destroyed from the air alone. They require ground-level assessment, engineering surveys, and in some cases, controlled demolition. Israeli combat engineers require physical access to confirm destruction. The forward positions Israeli forces have maintained inside Lebanon since the ceasefire are, in significant part,
operational platforms for exactly that kind of post-strike assessment and exploitation work. Here is where the historical parallel becomes instructive. In August 2006, following the month-long war between Israel and Hezbollah that ended with UN Security Council Resolution 1701, a similar dynamic played out. Resolution 1701 called for Israeli withdrawal from Lebanese territory, the disarmament of Hezbollah south of the Litani, and the deployment of an expanded UNIFIL force. None of those conditions were fully met. Hezbollah rearmed at a pace that Israeli and American intelligence officials described as astonishing. Within 2 years, its rocket inventory had returned to pre-war levels, and within a decade, it had multiplied by an order of magnitude. The lesson Israeli planners drew from 2006 was explicit and has been articulated by IDF officers in multiple forums. Diplomatic agreements that do not include physical enforcement mechanisms on the ground are not security arrangements. They are rearmament windows. The 2024 ceasefire, from the Israeli military's operational perspective, was designed from the outset to not repeat that mistake, which means it was designed, from the outset, to preserve Israeli freedom of action inside Lebanese territory, regardless of what the text of the agreement said. This is the part that requires careful attention, because it reframes the entire diplomatic event. If the ceasefire agreement was structured to allow Israel to maintain physical presence and operational capacity inside Lebanon, even informally, even in violation of its stated terms, then the American and French co-guarantors either consented to that structure or were deceived about it. Neither option is comfortable.
Consent would mean that Blinken's public statements about Lebanese sovereignty were performative rather than substantive, that the agreement was a diplomatic theater piece designed to reduce international pressure while allowing a pre-agreed Israeli operation to continue under cover of diplomatic language. Deception would mean that Israel leveraged American prestige for a ceasefire announcement without intending to honor its core provisions, and that Washington either has not noticed or has chosen not to respond publicly. Both scenarios describe a significant dysfunction in the alliance architecture that the United States has spent decades constructing in the Middle East. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's domestic political position is inseparable from this analysis.
As of late 2024, Netanyahu faced an ongoing criminal trial, a deeply fractured coalition held together partly by far-right ministers, including National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who have publicly stated that Israeli withdrawal from any Lebanese territory is unacceptable, and that military operations should continue until Hezbollah is permanently eliminated as a military organization. For Netanyahu, the ceasefire serves a dual purpose. Internationally, it reduces the pressure from Washington and Brussels that was beginning to affect weapons transfers and diplomatic cover. Domestically, the continued forward military posture allows him to argue to his coalition that the operation is not over, that Israel has not conceded anything, and that the agreement is simply a tactical pause in a continuing campaign. He is presenting the same agreement differently to different audiences simultaneously, and the international press has, for the most part, accepted the version intended for external consumption. Iranian strategic planners are watching this with a specific kind of attention. Hezbollah is not simply an allied militia from Tehran's perspective. It is the Western anchor of Iran's axis of resistance, a network of proxy forces and affiliated groups that Iran has constructed across Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon as a strategic deterrence architecture against both Israel and American military power in the region. The degradation of Hezbollah's military capacity during 60 days of Israeli operations, combined with the continuing Israeli presence in southern Lebanon during the ceasefire period, represents a significant erosion of that architecture. Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei faces a strategic calculation with no clean solution. Escalating to support Hezbollah risks direct confrontation with Israel and potentially the United States at a moment when Iran's economy is under severe sanctions pressure and its domestic political situation remains fragile following the protest movements of recent years. Not escalating signals weakness to Iran's regional partners and emboldens Israel to continue its incremental consolidation. The silence from Tehran during the ceasefire period is not satisfaction, it is calculation. The ripple effects of what is happening in southern Lebanon extend far beyond the immediate theater, and they are already visible in markets and diplomatic channels that rarely make connection to the specific events on the ground. Oil markets registered the ceasefire announcement with modest relief. Brent crude fell approximately $3 per barrel in the trading sessions immediately following the November 27th announcement, reflecting a reduced risk premium on potential regional escalation. That relief was premature. Traders who monitor UNIFIL violation data and satellite imagery more carefully than headline ceasefire announcements have noted that the physical situation on the ground has not stabilized in the way that the diplomatic announcement implied. The risk premium has not fully returned, but it has crept back. And if the 60-day window closes without genuine Israeli withdrawal, the reassessment of regional stability by energy markets could be sharp and rapid. A resumed escalation in Lebanon, particularly one that draws in Iranian-affiliated forces from Syria or involves strikes on Lebanese civilian infrastructure, would push oil prices in ways that affect European economies already strained by elevated energy costs following the Russia-Ukraine conflict. For the Biden administration's legacy, and for the incoming Trump administration's opening posture, the Lebanon ceasefire represents a case study in the gap between diplomatic achievement and strategic reality. The Biden team needed the ceasefire announcement for domestic and international reasons. It reduced the political cost of continued military support for Israel during an election period and gave European allies a deliverable they could point to. But if the agreement collapses, or if the violation record becomes too prominent to ignore, it retroactively damages American credibility as a guarantor. The Trump administration, which returned to the White House in January 2025 with a stated preference for strength-based deterrence and considerably less interest in multilateral diplomatic frameworks, will face a choice about whether to enforce the terms of an agreement negotiated by its predecessor or to redefine American expectations in ways that effectively endorse the Israeli forward posture. Early signals from Trump's Middle East team suggest the latter is more likely, which removes the last formal constraint on Israeli operational activity in Lebanon and sets the stage for a post-ceasefire environment in which the agreement exists only on paper. The relationship between Washington and Paris, already strained by disagreements over NATO burden sharing and African policy, absorbs another quiet fracture. France co-guaranteed an agreement whose terms are being visibly violated. If Paris protests too loudly, it risks diplomatic friction with Israel and tension with Washington. If it stays silent, it demonstrates that French co-guarantorship is a diplomatic gesture rather than a genuine security commitment, which undermines France's broader argument that it should be taken seriously as an independent strategic actor in the Mediterranean and Middle East. Neither outcome serves French interests. Both outcomes are already unfolding. The broader global power balance question turns on what this moment demonstrates about the enforceability of American brokered agreements in a multipolar environment. Russia and China have both noted, with varying degrees of public commentary, the gap between the ceasefire's stated terms and its observable implementation. For Beijing, which is watching American credibility in the Pacific with acute attention, every instance in which American diplomatic guarantees prove hollow in one theater is a data point for calculations about how American guarantees might function in another. This is not a theoretical observation. Chinese analysts at institutions affiliated with the People's Liberation Army have published commentary drawing explicit comparisons between American enforcement capacity in the Middle East and American commitments in the Taiwan Strait. The connection is being made. It is being filed. What we are watching in southern Lebanon is not a ceasefire that partially failed. It is a ceasefire that is functioning exactly as its architects intended, which is to say, it is providing diplomatic cover for a military operation that has not ended, under terms that neither party expects to fully honor, guaranteed by powers that have concluded that enforcement would cost more than acquiescence. That is a profoundly destabilizing precedent, not because Lebanon is the most important strategic theater in the world, but because the pattern it establishes travels. It travels to every future agreement brokered under American or Western auspices. It travels to every party calculating whether a signed document is a constraint or a tool. It travels to every adversary of the existing order, who is looking for evidence that the order's rules apply selectively, and that selective application is itself the rule. The 60-day implementation window will close. When it does, one of three things happens. Israel withdraws in a visible, verifiable way, and the agreement is belatedly honored. Israel formally acknowledges that it will maintain positions inside Lebanon, and the agreement is openly discarded. Or the situation drifts into a gray zone of indefinite partial occupation and periodic violence that no official is willing to describe accurately, because accurate description requires accountability. The third option is the most likely because it is the most convenient for every government involved. Convenience, in geopolitics, is almost always the enemy of clarity. And it is clarity, the willingness to name what is actually happening rather than what we were told would happen, that has been the first and most significant casualty of this ceasefire. The Lebanon War did not end on November 27, 2024. It changed its name. Subscribe to the proxy signal. We'll be here when the next development breaks.